Welcome to my bedtime history channel. Tonight's journey is a long one, but if you stay with me until the very end, you may begin to see that this story is not really about the filth and plagues of the Middle Ages, but about the astounding capacity of the human body to endure suffering and the quiet dignity of simply surviving another day. We have been conditioned by centuries of romantic literature and cinematic illusion to imagine the medieval era as a golden epoch of gallant knights, chivalric romance, and candlelit feasts within grand stone halls. We look back at that distant time through a lens heavily colored by fantasy, seeking a comforting escape from the complex anxieties of our modern existence. Yet the authentic reality of this harsh period was something entirely different, stripped completely of all soft velvet and polished silver. It was a gritty, unforgiving landscape defined by constant physical discomfort, pervasive sickness, and an intimate daily relationship with mortality. Tonight we will peel away the gilded myth to examine the raw, unfiltered texture of ordinary human life. You are asked to leave behind your modern conceptions of comfort, privacy, and safety as we step across the dark threshold of the 14th century. Lower the lights in your room, allow the sounds of the present world to fade into absolute silence, and prepare to enter time. Simply drawing another breath was considered a profound victory. Chapter 1. The most profound battles of the medieval world were not fought by armored men on grand fields, but by ordinary people waking up in the freezing dark. Imagine opening your eyes in the bitter chill of a November morning in the year 1325. The very first sensation that greets you is not peaceful rest, but a deep, pervasive ache settling heavily into the deepest marrow of your fragile bones. Your bed is nothing more than a coarse linen sack roughly stuffed with damp straw, rotting hay, and countless unseen insects. There exists no memory foam to cradle your exhausted spine, no soft pillows to rest your heavy head, and certainly no woven cotton sheets to protect your fragile skin. You are wrapped solely in a heavy, scratchy wool blanket that has not witnessed water or soap since the previous winter. It carries the dense, suffocating weight of accumulated sweat, dirt, and historical grime. As the heavy darkness slowly thins, the distant, iron clang of a village church bell shatters the fragile silence. It functions as the unforgiving alarm clock of the era, dictating the rhythm of your monotonous life with absolute, divine authority. You blink against the stinging cold air, quickly realizing that your physical suffering has merely been paused by sleep, not erased. When the human mind succumbs to exhaustion in the dark, it briefly escapes the tyranny of the feudal system. In your fleeting dreams, you are unburdened by the heavy taxes of the Lord, unbothered by the constant threat of famine, and unscathed by the cruel grip of winter. Sleep serves as the only true sanctuary available to the impoverished and overworked soul. But the ringing church bell violently severs that fragile illusion, pulling your consciousness back into a fragile shell of a body. Modern humanity often greets the dawn, with optimism viewing the rising sun as a symbol of renewal and endless possibility. For the medieval laborer, the dawn simply signified the inevitable resumption of a lifelong sentence of unpaid physical toll. Your home is a fragile wooden hut, constructed with walls of woven twigs slathered thickly in dried mud and animal dung. It features a charming open concept design, which in this brutal era simply means that you, your extended family, and your valuable livestock all share the exact same confined breathing space. There are no glass windows to stop the piercing winter wind. The smell waiting for you in the dim light is a thick, almost palpable symphony of unwashed humanity. It is a deeply complex blend of stale, fermented beer, sour human sweat, damp animal fur, and the pervasive odor of wood smoke that constantly irritates your reddened eyes. There are no scented candles to mask the stark, overwhelming reality of your daily existence. Even if such fragrant luxuries had been invented, they would merely melt unceremoniously onto the cold, hard dirt floor beneath your body. You attempt to stretch your stiff limbs, but instantly regret the motion, as the freezing air bites hungrily at your exposed flesh. At the age of 22, you are already entering what your rough society considers the middle stage of life. Your spine creaks with the same protest as an old wooden door left to rust in the relentless rain. Your knees ache with a hollow pain, sounding like small stones grinding violently together with every reluctant movement. The constant malnutrition and brutal physical labor have aged your cellular structure far beyond your actual years, forcing you to carry an invisible burden always. Modern humans often wake up paralyzed by status anxiety, terrified of failing, to achieve abstract professional goals or maintaining carefully curated public images. We obsess over our social standing and our upward mobility. The medieval peasant wakened with a vastly simpler, but infinitely heavier dread. The primal fear of failing to secure enough calories to keep the vulnerable heart beating. Finding the will to pull yourself from the meager warmth of the wool blanket is a daily psychological gamble. The dirt floor awaiting your bare feet is either slick from the heavy rain that steadily leaks through the rotting thatch roof, or it is crusty from the chickens roosting in the corner. Every single step is a delicate negotiation with disgust. The very concept of personal privacy remains an utterly foreign illusion that no ordinary person could ever fathom. Your entire immediate family and perhaps an orphaned cousin or an elderly aunt are slowly waking up mere inches beside you. There are no separate bedrooms, no modesty curtains, and absolutely no solitary moments to gather your scattered thoughts before the chaos truly begins. It is a communal existence dictated by pure, unforgiving necessity rather than any cultural preference for closeness. You endure because surviving the brutal elements requires the collective body heat and shared resources of the group. Welcome to the bleak morning routine of medieval Europe, where parasites, rodents, and exhausted humans exist together in a constant, silent, and desperate physical struggle. Modern society often suffers from an intense psychological isolation, where we hide inside our spacious homes, desperately seeking connection through glowing screens. We fear loneliness while fiercely guarding our independence. Yet the peasant of the 14th century possessed the exact opposite anxiety. They were never truly alone, smothered by proximity but entirely starved of individual agency or a moment of pure peace. Your hands reach out in the gloom, brushing against the rough, splintered wood of the supporting beams. When the bitter wind howls across the open fields, it easily pierces the countless cracks in the mud walls, turning the interior into an absolute icebox. You shiver uncontrollably, desperately wishing for just a fraction of the radiant warmth that wealthy nobles casually ignored in their fortresses. As you finally stand upright, the damp wool of your tunic clings uncomfortably to your shivering frame. You did not remove your garments before sleeping, because the freezing air commands you to retain every possible layer of woven protection. Your clothes serve as both your daily uniform and your nightly armor against the relentless, biting chill of the wet mud floor. The church bell continues to toll. In the distance, its heavy iron voice echoing across the frost-covered valley. This sound is not merely a measure of passing time. It is a heavy oral reminder of your eternal subjugation to the divine and earthly authorities. The church dictates the boundaries of your mind, while the feudal lord claims absolute ownership over your body. There is a profound silence beneath the sounds of the rustling animals and the groaning timbers of the hut. It is the quiet resignation of millions of souls who deeply understood their fixed place within an unbreakable divine hierarchy. You never once ask yourself what you want to do today, because destiny has already cemented your miserable path without your permission. The sheer physical will required just to stand up requires a monumental effort of the human spirit. Your body deeply remembers the aching labor of yesterday and intuitively understands that today will demand the exact same brutal tribute. You do not rise from the cold earth motivated by ambition or passion, but by the cruel, simple math of bleak agricultural survival. This morning ritual contains no small comforts, no warm beverages waiting to soothe your sore throat, and no moment of peaceful contemplation. It is an immediate, harsh transition from unconscious relief to conscious agony. Yet, within this bleak and hopeless awakening, a strange and indomitable human resilience quietly forges itself, proving that the desire to exist can heavily outweigh endless suffering. In a world where comfort did not exist, the simple act of opening your eyes and stepping onto the cold dirt was the first act of defiance against an unforgiving universe. Chapter 2. The absolute stripping of physical dignity is the first quiet tax levied upon the soul by a harsh and unforgiving world. Having successfully navigated the psychological hurdle of simply rising from the freezing dirt, your body immediately issues its next undeniable demand. In the modern era, the morning routine is a private, sanitized ritual of purification performed behind locked porcelain doors. But in the 14th century, the natural biological functions of the human body are transformed into a daily exercise in profound humiliation and sensory endurance. There exists absolutely no hidden plumbing to carry your burdens away into an invisible subterranean network. If you reside in a typical peasant dwelling, your designated sanctuary is merely a splintered wooden bucket resting ominously in the shadowed corner of the yard. This crude vessel is likely already brimming from the restless night, offering a potent, biblical stench that aggressively assaults the cold morning air. Disposing of this daily accumulation requires a casual disregard for public sanitation that modern sensibilities simply cannot fathom. You must physically carry the heavy, sloshing bucket to the threshold of your home and violently heave its contents directly into the narrow, unpaved street. A quick, guttural warning cry is expected. But the medieval street remains a slow-moving, foul-smelling river of animal droppings, rotting food, and human waste. If you are fortunate enough to dwell within a larger, fortified town boasting public latrines, you quickly discover that privacy is a completely fictional concept. You are forced to sit shoulder to shoulder upon a long wooden bench beside absolute strangers, breathing in an atmosphere where proper ventilation is nothing but a cruel architectural joke. The vulnerability of the human body is placed on stark, unapologetic public display. The modern luxury of soft paper is entirely unheard of, leaving you to rely upon whatever coarse materials the harsh environment provides. A handful of dry straw, brittle autumn leaves, damp moss gathered from the forest floor, or perhaps a rough scrap of discarded wool must suffice. This persistent lack of basic hygiene explains precisely why physical touch and close proximity often carried the invisible, deadly weight of impending disease. even if you were elevated enough to inhabit a towering stone castle. The bleak reality of bodily functions only marginally improved. The aristocratic equivalent of a restroom was the garderobe, a drafty stone alcove protruding over the outer walls, dropping waste directly into the stagnant waters of the defensive moat below. Yet even this elevated privilege carried severe risks, as clever enemy soldiers were known to climb up through these very shafts during sudden, brutal sieges. Whether you are a struggling farmer or a wealthy baron wrapped in velvet, the act of relieving oneself is a stark, unavoidable reminder of human frailty. You cannot escape the filth. You must simply integrate it into the background noise of your daily survival. It is an environment so thoroughly saturated in contamination that a single slip upon the wet cobblestones leaves you face first in the accumulated remnants of a struggling society. We often forget that the greatest luxury of the modern age is not our technology, but the simple, uncelebrated privilege of closing a solid door against the world. Chapter 3. True nourishment requires a sense of safety, but for the medieval peasant, every meal was merely a calculated negotiation with starvation. Having survived the bitter indignities of the freezing morning, you might naturally expect the restorative comfort of a warm breakfast. In the modern world, the morning meal represents a quiet moment of solitude, accompanied by roasted coffee and fresh ingredients. Yet within the damp walls of your 14th century hut, culinary comfort is an entirely alien concept. Here, breakfast is not prepared, it is simply endured. You squat warily beside the smoldering central hearth, reaching for a carved wooden bowl filled with a substance resembling wet mortar. This is pottage, the absolute foundation of the peasant diet. It is a thick, gloomy stew constructed from foraged root vegetables, tough grains, and perhaps a few fortunate beans. The heavy iron pot hangs over the fire continually, simmering for uncountable days or even consecutive weeks. Fresh ingredients are haphazardly dumped atop the older, dissolving layers, transforming the cauldron into a perpetual, edible experiment driven by desperation. To accompany this gray sludge, you are provided a dense hunk of bread so profoundly hard it could successfully deflect a fired arrow, fashioned from coarse rye or rough barley. The dough is frequently bulked out with foraged acorns or even swept sawdust during particularly lean harvests. Soft, white wheat bread remains a distant aristocratic fantasy kept firmly locked behind high castle walls. You do not delicately slice your morning loaf, you must aggressively negotiate with it, softening the brittle crust in the murky depth of your pottage simply to protect your aching teeth. To wash down this joyless feast, you do not reach for clean spring water, for the local streams harbor invisible armies of parasites. Water is a silent killer waiting in the shallows. Therefore, you begin your laborious day by drinking warm, cloudy ale long before the sun has fully risen. This small beer, consumed even by young children, possesses a low alcohol content but offers a high probability of bodily survival. The brewing process required prolonged boiling, unwittingly sparing the village from the lethal bacteria swarming within the muddy town ditches. The savory delights of smoked meat or cured cheese belong exclusively to holy Sundays and rare feast days, bestowed only if your ruling lord feels particularly generous. A mere pinch of exotic black pepper commands a price exceeding your entire monthly wage, and essential salt is guarded like precious gold. You chew your gritty sustenance in silence, hoping the scavenging rats did not nibble your portion overnight. When the primary purpose of sustenance is merely to postpone a slow surrender to the earth, the human palate quickly forgets the very concept of joy. Chapter 4. The most intimate prison a person can inhabit is woven from the very fabric meant to protect them. Having concluded your meager and joyless meal, you face the daily necessity of dressing for the bitter elements. In the modern era, a wardrobe represents personal expression, changing seasons, and meticulous hygiene. Within your dimly lit hut, fashion is an entirely meaningless concept. Your entire collection of clothing consists of exactly one indestructible outfit, designed strictly for survival, rather than aesthetic pleasure. You wear a coarse, unyielding tunic crafted from rough wool or unbleached linen. This single garment has been worn continuously, every single day for uncountable months, perhaps even spanning multiple years. There exists no option to change according to the shifting weather. You simply endure this heavy layer until the fabric eventually disintegrates into ragged threads or foaments, a painful fungal infection against your damp flesh. Beneath this scratchy exterior, protective undergarments remain, an optional luxury you likely cannot afford. You are forced to exist directly against the harsh, abrasive wool, lovingly stitched together by calloused hands that prioritize durability over comfort. Your clothing remains perpetually stained, dangerously stiffened by dried sweat, and intensely scented, like a decomposing, compost pile left to marinate inside a damp animal enclosure. The modern miracle of automated washing machines and scented soap resides centuries in the distant future. Cleansing your solitary tunic requires a monumental investment of physical energy. You must physically haul heavy wooden buckets of water from the distant river, boil it violently over a precious wood fire, and vigorously scrub the thick fabric using harsh wood ashes and corrosive lye. Even if you manage this exhausting ritual, the sun rarely pierces the heavy European cloud cover long enough to thoroughly dry the dense wool. Therefore, you simply wear the filth like a second, heavier skin. Protecting your feet offers no true solace. If you are fortunate enough to possess footwear, they are merely scraps of untreated leather crudely stitched together, offering absolutely no structural support against the unforgiving earth. Many impoverished peasants simply traverse the landscape entirely barefoot. You navigate through freezing mud, animal excrement, sharp jagged rocks, and deep puddles teeming with invisible diseases. Because of this constant exposure, your own skin swiftly becomes a hostile territory. It is a thriving, restless ecosystem for fleas, lice, and ravenous bedbugs that leave rent-free upon your exhausted body. This infestation recognizes no social boundaries. Everyone surrounding you carries these microscopic passengers. Pious monks, wealthy nobles, and crying children are all walking, unwilling sanctuaries for parasites. No one escapes the relentless itch. You scrape your raw skin with a carved wooden spoon while conversing with the local priest, and neither of you bothers to acknowledge the action because it is utterly normalized. Your scalp functions as a perpetual battlefield of bleeding bites, and your shoulders burn from endless friction. If you develop a severe, spreading rash, there exists no medical professional to diagnose scabies or prescribe a soothing ointment. You simply integrate the searing discomfort into your daily existence. The pain accompanies you for months like a shadowy, unwanted companion bound to your flesh. When the very clothes upon your back cause you continual agony, the simple act of existing becomes a monumental feat of silent endurance. Chapter 5. A smile, often considered the most universal gesture of human warmth, served in the medieval era as a stark, perilous revelation of internal decay. Having draped your exhausted body in damp, scratching wool, the modern instinct might prompt you to greet the harsh morning with a resilient smile. Yet, within the gritty reality of the 14th century, parting your lips is a dangerous exhibition. There exists absolutely no pristine ritual of morning oral hygiene to wash away the sour, lingering tastes of yesterday's survival. The comforting modern arsenal of mint-flavored paste-bristled brushes and purifying mouthwashes is an unimaginable fantasy. The concept of dental preservation is entirely absent from the medieval consciousness. Some desperate souls might occasionally gnaw upon a frayed twig or hastily rinse their mouths with watered wine or sharp vinegar. But these are feeble gestures against an inevitable, advancing rot. By the time you reach your mid-20s, your mouth has silently transformed into a haunted crypt of fractured enamel and swollen tissue. The relentless consumption of coarse, stone-ground bread, heavily laced with actual grit and abrasive dust from the millstone, slowly grinds away the protective layers of your teeth. Rampant cavities are not merely inconveniences. They are permanent, painful fixtures of your skull. In a fascinating twist of historical irony, the wealthy aristocracy often suffered far worse dental agonies than the impoverished peasants. The slow introduction of imported sugar transformed dental decay into a perverse status symbol. While you lose your teeth gradually to gritty porridge, the nobility aggressively rot their own mouths with expensive, sweetened cakes, literally paying a fortune to accelerate their physical ruin. Consequently, the medieval toothache is not a rare, alarming medical event requiring an urgent intervention. It is an ambient, relentless background noise to everyday existence. It is a deep, rhythmic throbbing that violently shatters your concentration and tests the absolute limits of your sanity. It forces rational men to seriously contemplate extracting their own teeth with rusted blacksmith pliers just to find silence. When the agony finally becomes utterly unbearable, you do not seek a sanitized medical professional. You seek the local barber surgeon. This is the exact same individual who casually shears your hair and bleeds your veins. In the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle, he approaches your trembling jaw, wielding a crude iron hook, offering absolutely nothing to dull the impending, blinding agony. The extraction itself is an exercise in primal, screaming endurance, but the true terror begins after the shattered tooth is forcefully wrenched from your bleeding gums. In a world completely devoid of antibiotics or basic germ theory, an open wound inside the mouth is a highly efficient invitation to sepsis. A mundane cavity could easily mutate into a raging fever and a swift death. This inescapable physical decay profoundly altered the landscape of human intimacy. The concept of romantic proximity was heavily overshadowed by the universal reality of severe halitosis. When seeking a lifelong partner in this brutal environment, you did not evaluate the brightness of their smile. You coldly calculated the fertility of their land and the robust health of their livestock. We spend vast fortunes today perfecting the aesthetics of our teeth, entirely forgetting that for most of human history, a tightly closed mouth was simply a shield against agonizing vulnerability. Chapter 6. The most exhausting burdens imposed upon the human spirit are rarely born of grand ambition, but of the quiet, relentless demands of mere survival. Having endured the agony of a fractured smile and a joyless meal, you must now drag your weary bones past the threshold of your hut. The modern concept of employment involves structured hours, ergonomic desks, and negotiated benefits. In the 14th century, your occupation is not a chosen career path. It is a brutal, inescapable inheritance dictated entirely by the dirt beneath your freezing feet. Your primary purpose on this earth is to labor endlessly so that a distant feudal lord might enjoy a life of uninterrupted comfort. This aristocratic master commands your total allegiance, yet likely possesses absolutely no knowledge of your given name. You represent nothing more than a disposable biological engine, designed to extract wealth from the stubborn soil until your physical form eventually crumbles into dust. Your workday commences when the sun finally breaches the jagged horizon and concludes only when the fading light leaves you in total darkness. You labor intensely for 6 agonizing days each week, utilizing primitive tools like a heavy wooden hoe, a rusted iron sickle, and the fragile cartilage of your own spine. There exists absolutely no possibility of clocking out or seeking a momentary reprieve from the strain. The solitary day of supposed rest is Sunday, yet this brief pause offers no true physical relief. It is consumed by urgent domestic survival, fervent prayers for salvation, and the desperate tending of infected wounds. For a woman, this burden is exponentially heavier, as she must toil unceasingly in the muddy fields before returning to a hut demanding endless cleaning, cooking, and the desperate care of fragile children. Childhood itself is a vastly abridged and somber chapter of life, with children expected to contribute heavy physical labor by the tender age of 5. If you are fortunate enough to escape the plow and work as a blacksmith or tanner, you simply exchange the sun-baked fields for toxic, suffocating sheds. You breathe in noxious, chemical fumes and searing smoke for a pittance that barely sustains your beating heart. In the modern corporate hierarchy, employees often agonize over stalled promotions or lack of meaningful recognition. Your medieval anxiety is infinitely more visceral. If you sustain a crippling injury or succumb to a raging fever, you cannot afford a single day of rest. In this unforgiving economy, if you do not plunge your hands into the dirt, you simply do not eat, and your empty place is instantly filled. The true measure of human endurance is found not in glorious rebellion, but in the silent resignation of lifting a heavy tool one more time. Chapter 7. The illusion of human mastery over nature dissolves entirely when a fragile body is trapped inside a dwelling that offers no true shelter from the sky. Having endured the crushing physical demands of the muddy fields, you might desperately seek a comfortable sanctuary from the surrounding elements. In our modern existence, we curate our desired temperatures with the casual flick of a digital dial. We have conquered the changing seasons, insulating ourselves entirely from the harsh, unforgiving reality of the outdoors. For the medieval peasant, the weather does not represent a temporary inconvenience. It functions as an ongoing, unrelenting punishment delivered directly from the heavens. As brutal winter descends across the land, your fragile woodent offers absolutely no meaningful insulation. The bitter, freezing wind howls effortlessly through the wide gaps in the woven walls. There exists no solid glass to seal your narrow windows, only thin pieces of worn cloth that vainly flap against the freezing gales. You possess a small central hearth, yet gathering adequate firewood presents a tremendous legal and physical challenge. The surrounding ancient forests usually belong exclusively to the wealthy feudal lord. Gathering fallen branches without explicit permission can result in severe judicial punishment or even sudden execution. Therefore, you simply huddle miserably near the dying, smoky embers, wrapped tightly in your single, damp woolen tunic. You wake repeatedly, with a freezing face, numb extremities, and a deep-bone chill that never truly vanishes. When the relentless seasons finally shift, you might falsely anticipate some welcome relief. Yet the arrival of summer merely replaces the freezing misery with a suffocating, humid agony. Your enclosed mud home swiftly transforms into a baking clay oven, completely devoid of any refreshing cross breeze or means of cooling the stagnant air. You cannot simply remove your heavy layers of coarse wool to find relief from the sun. Strict societal modesty, the constant threat of severe sunburn, and swarming insects demand that you remain fully clothed. You endlessly sweat through your scratchy garments, creating a damp, hostile environment against your skin that fiercely aggravates your rashes. The rising heat swiftly accelerates the rot of discarded food and animal waste, summoning thick clouds of biting flies and restless mosquitoes. They relentlessly attack your unwashed body while you attempt to seek sleep. Out in the open fields, the merciless sun bakes your shoulders without pity while you continue your exhausting, unpaid labor. To exist in a world completely devoid of climate control is to accept that the atmosphere itself is a silent, unyielding adversary that must be endlessly endured. Chapter 8. The most essential element for human survival was transformed by ignorance into a silent, flowing weapon. Modern minds often conjure romantic visions of pristine medieval streams of bubbling crystal clear through enchanted emerald forests. Yet the reality of the 14th century water supply was a horrific, microscopic battlefield. That seemingly idyllic brook meandering past your village carried a lethal cargo of human waste, discarded refuse, and the decaying corpses of feral animals. Every single unboiled drop harbored a vast, invisible army of lethal parasites and thriving bacteria. Because pure hydration was essentially a game of lethal roulette, society was forced to adapt through continuous intoxication. You did not reach for a cup of cool water to quench your crushing thirst. You consumed weak, fermented ale from the moment you woke. This small beer, handed freely, even to stumbling toddlers, possessed a low alcohol content but offered the absolute miracle of having been vigorously boiled during the brewing process. If consuming water was considered extremely perilous, the concept of submerging your entire body within it was deemed utterly reckless. In the modern era, a hot shower represents the ultimate daily purification, washing away the heavy anxieties of the pounding world. But medical consensus in the Middle Ages dictated that hot water dangerously opened the fragile pores of your skin, readily inviting deadly plagues and full miasmas directly into your bloodstream. Therefore, a thick, unbroken layer of crusty filth was actively cultivated and proudly worn as a biological armor against invisible diseases. You believed you were vastly safer remaining completely unwashed than risking the horrific vulnerability of being naked and clean. The few communal bathhouses that did exist quickly degraded into scandalous havens of illicit gossip and sin, prompting the righteous church to swiftly condemn and close them to protect public morality. Should you foolishly defy both medical advice and religious warning to attempt a private bath, the physical labor required was monumental. You must exhaustingly haul heavy, sloshing wooden buckets from the distant well, boil the murky liquid over a precious smoldering fire, and fill a splintered, leaking tub. Then you must eagerly share that exact same stagnant, gray water with every single exhausted member of your crowded, flea-bitten household. We casually turn a polished handle for endless, pure hydration, entirely forgetting that for centuries, a simple drink of water required a desperate gamble with death itself. Chapter 9. The most terrifying consequence of a fragile existence is seeking salvation from hands that only understand how to deliver pain. Having navigated the lethal hazards of stagnant water and exhausting labor, inevitable sickness eventually claims your body. In our modern reality, illness is a temporary deviation quickly corrected by sanitized clinics and precise chemical remedies. But in the 14th century, falling ill initiates a terrifying descent into a medical system that resembles polite, theological torture. The ruling scientific doctrine of your era dictates that your physical vessel is governed entirely by four mysterious humors. These vital fluids consist of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your bodily health is viewed as a precarious internal soup that must remain in perfect, divine balance. Any minor ailment is confidently diagnosed as a chaotic imbalance of these internal forces. Should you suffer the burning agony of a sudden fever, the physician concludes you possess an arrogant excess of blood. The prescribed remedy is not a soothing medication, but immediate and violent bloodletting. The barber surgeon, the exact same calloused man who casually cuts your hair, approaches your bedside holding a dull iron blade or a collection of ravenous, writhing leeches. If the crushing weight of your bleak existence manifests as deep anxiety or profound sadness, this is diagnosed as an overabundance of black bile. Your heavy psychological suffering is met with severe physical purging. You are prescribed harsh, dehydrating laxatives while your terrified family avoids your gaze, quietly preparing the wooden planks for your eventual coffin. The horror multiplies exponentially should you suffer a shattered bone or a deep, festering wound from the muddy fields. The miraculous mercy of modern anesthesia remains centuries in the distant future. If a shattered limb must be violently removed to halt spreading putrefaction, your only solace is the desperate hope that you might quickly pass out from the blinding agony. Surgical instruments are complete strangers to the concept of sanitation. Heavy iron blades are casually heated over a smoky fire, not to eradicate invisible bacteria, but simply because the searing heat superficially cauterizes the bleeding flesh. Germ theory is an utterly unknown fantasy. Your society firmly believes that invisible, foul-smelling miasmas actively cause your searing physical suffering. Medicine and theology are deeply, inextricably woven together in a tight knot of superstitious fear. If your stomach aggressively rebels against rotten meat, the local priest solemnly declares it a direct manifestation of your secret, sinful thoughts. You are forced to loudly confess your moral failings between violent bouts of illness, desperately hoping to appease a disappointed creator. If by some utter miracle of human biology you actually manage to recover, the surviving physician triumphantly claims absolute credit for your healing. The sated leech is metaphorically promoted, while your brutalized body is expected to immediately return to the aching labor of the fields. You have not been healed. You have merely survived the desperate cure. True despair is realizing that the prescribed medical remedy holds vastly more horror than the invisible disease slowly consuming your flesh. Chapter 10. The most absolute form of tyranny does not confine the physical body, but builds invisible walls around the deepest anxieties of the human soul. As the dim light of the sun finally surrenders to the heavy darkness of the medieval evening, your exhausted body cries out for rest. Yet, the psychological burden of your existence merely shifts its weight. You might falsely believe the brutal labor of the day has concluded, but you are constantly watched. A divine, unforgiving gaze tracks your every faltering step and your suspicious neighbors stand ready to report any minor moral deviation to the waiting authorities. In the modern world, religion often functions as a private, compartmentalized comfort, accessed deliberately during moments of deep personal grief or joyous celebration. However, in the 14th century, the Church does not merely exist alongside your life. It is the absolute, unquestionable framework of your entire reality. It functions as your supreme spiritual landlord, dictating your laws, your modest education, your marriage, and the ultimate destination of your fragile soul. The rhythm of your bleak existence is meticulously regulated by the relentless tolling of the heavy bronze town bell. It rings with authoritative force in the misty morning, at the exhausted peak of noon, and in the freezing night. This sound does not simply mark the passing hours. It represents a mandatory demand for immediate spiritual submission. Missing a required prayer is not a minor oversight. It is a dangerous transgression against the architect of the cosmos. The concept of sin is inextricably woven into the very fabric of your daily mundane actions. Consuming a morsel of meat on a forbidden Friday, or harboring a fleeting, bitter thought about your miserable condition adds immediate weight to your spiritual debt. The concept of hell is not a vague, metaphorical warning. It is a vividly real, terrifying landscape of boiling blood, eternal fire, and gleeful demons preached repeatedly from the dimly lit pulpit. You are entirely stripped of the ability to seek your own divine comfort, for the sacred scriptures are written exclusively in Latin. This ancient language is intentionally guarded by pious monks and wealthy aristocrats, creating an impenetrable barrier between you and your Creator. You must rely completely upon the local priest to translate the will of God, meaning his personal ambitions and worldly prejudices become your absolute, unquestionable truth. This spiritual monopoly demands a crushing physical toll through the mandatory system of tithes. You are legally compelled to surrender 1/10 of your meager possessions directly to the church. If you cultivate a small field of wheat, you give them grain. If you raise a handful of scrawny chickens, you must surrender their precious eggs. To arrive empty-handed is to declare yourself both spiritually bankrupt and socially condemned within the tight-knit village. Even the promised relief of holy days offers little genuine rest. These mandatory occasions require exhausting attendance at elaborate masses, strict dietary fasting, and the public confession of your deepest humiliations. True joy or unfiltered laughter is often viewed with intense suspicion, considered a dangerous indulgence that distracts the mortal soul. To openly question this heavy architecture of control invites swift, brutal violence, ranging from public flogging to a fiery death at the stake. When salvation is weaponized as an instrument of total control, faith ceases to be a sanctuary and becomes a lifelong sentence of psychological servitude. Chapter 11. The heaviest burdens of history are rarely recorded in grand chronicles, but are carried silently in the exhausted bodies of those denied a voice. If you believe the general suffering of a medieval peasant was an unbearable ordeal, you must now strip away whatever tiny fraction of autonomy remained. To exist as a woman in the 14th century was to navigate an inherently hostile world entirely devoid of personal agency. You were not merely battling the relentless cold, the gnawing hunger, and the pervasive filth. You were concurrently fighting a lifelong sentence of absolute social invisibility and total subservience to male authority. From the very moment of your birth, your entire earthly trajectory was rigorously locked into place by a patriarchal society that valued obedience above all else. Your potential for intellectual development was swiftly severed the moment you mastered the exhausting arts of churning heavy butter or mending torn woolen tunics. Formal education was an exclusive privilege highly guarded by men, ensuring that the vast majority of women remained completely disconnected from the written word and broader knowledge. The modern ideal of romantic devotion held absolutely no relevance in the bleak calculus of medieval matrimony. Marriage was a brutally pragmatic transaction, arranged exclusively to consolidate small parcels of arable land, transfer valuable livestock, and forge necessary survival alliances. It was not uncommon to be formally betrothed by the tender age of 12 and carrying a child by 14, handed over as legal property to a husband whose authority over your physical being was absolute. Once bound by sacred vows, your sole purpose was reduced to an endless cycle of biological and domestic production. You were expected to produce vital heirs, prepare the scant meals, maintain the crumbling hut, and manage the flocks, all without whispering a single word of complaint. To openly express deep frustration or challenge your crushing reality was to risk being branded a troublesome nag, a dangerous social transgression that often invited severe physical discipline. The act of bringing new life into this filthy world was nothing less than a terrifying game of chance. Childbirth functioned as a gruesome death lottery, utterly devoid of prenatal care, sterile medical instruments, or anesthetic relief. You relied entirely upon the passed-down wisdom of village midwives, knowing intimately that a minor complication usually guaranteed a slow, agonizing death for both the mother and the struggling infant upon a blood-soaked mattress of rotting straw. If you miraculously survived the searing torment of delivery, society offered absolutely no period of restorative convalescence. With a screaming infant strapped tightly to your chest inside a lice-ridden dwelling, your workload exponentially multiplied. You were required to nurse the child, scrub the filthy cooking cauldrons, and immediately return to the muddy fields to harvest turnips, serving endlessly as the indispensable backbone of a feudal economy that fundamentally refused to acknowledge your humanity. To exist outside the strict confines of marriage or motherhood was to invite intense, lethal suspicion. An unmarried woman was viewed as a social aberration. A widowed woman was prey to financial ruin, and an outspoken woman was deemed inherently dangerous. Those who possessed deep herbal knowledge displayed unapologetic independence, or simply rebuked a drunken neighbor risked the terrifying accusation of witchcraft, a fatal label that readily earned a swift drowning or a fiery execution. The true strength of a society is never measured by the castles it builds, but by the endless torment it casually demands from its most vulnerable creators. Chapter 12. True order is rarely established through the quiet application of impartial justice, but rather through the theatrical and brutal exhibition of absolute violence. Having somehow survived the gnawing famine, the microscopic plagues, and the crushing social hierarchy, you must confront the most pervasive element of the 14th century, the modern concept of civic law, maintained by objective courts and protective institutions, remains an unfathomable fantasy. Instead, your daily safety relies entirely upon the arbitrary, shifting temperament of heavily armed men who possess unchecked authority. Violence was not viewed as a sudden, tragic breakdown of a functioning society. It was the very foundation upon which the entire feudal system rested. The concept of criminal justice did not seek to gently rehabilitate the erring soul or restore communal peace. It aimed solely to severely mutilate the physical body as a permanent, bleeding warning to others. Should you desperately steal a stale loaf of bread, the executioner's heavy axe might swiftly claim your right hand. Should you be accused of a vastly darker crime, such as dangerous heresy or malicious witchcraft, you were thrust directly into the terrifying spectacle known as trial by ordeal. To prove your fragile innocence, you were forced to plunge your bare arm deep into a boiling cauldron to retrieve a submerged stone. If the searing blisters festered and rotted after 3 agonizing days, your guilt was officially confirmed by the inevitable spreading infection. Alternatively, the righteous authorities might violently bind your wrists and toss you into the deep, churning river to test your purity. If you tragically sank to the muddy bottom and drowned, your innocence was posthumously vindicated before God. If you managed to miraculously float, you were deemed a guilty sorcerer and condemned to death. It was a sadistic judicial game supervised by cruel men actively rooting for your demise. If condemned by these absurd superstitious metrics, your subsequent execution became a highly anticipated civic festival. The modern mind recoils at bloody spectacle, but the medieval crowd eagerly gathered to witness brutal hangings, decapitations, and searing burnings. This gruesome entertainment functioned as a deliberate psychological mechanism designed by the ruling class. By witnessing the utter destruction of another human being, the exhausted peasants were briefly distracted from the gnawing emptiness residing within their own stomachs. This unrelenting cruelty seeped downward from the lofty throne directly into the muddy and filthy streets. Husbands were explicitly encouraged by sacred law to violently discipline their subservient wives and trembling children. Sudden, lethal brawls frequently erupted over a spilled cup of sour ale or a perceived slight from a proud nobleman's horse. You walked continuously with your weary head bowed, deeply aware that a single misplaced glance could readily invite a crushing blow to the skull. When a society employs unchecked cruelty as its primary language of control, the oppressed soul inevitably learns to speak in the exact same bloody dialect. Chapter 13. The ultimate measure of a brutal era is found not in how its people lived, but in how quickly and quietly they were expected to disappear. Having successfully navigated the daily labyrinth of fleas, famine, and unpredictable violence, you must now confront the bleakest reality of the 14th century. To simply remain breathing past the age of 40 was considered a statistical miracle. You were not merely aging. You were actively surviving an endless gauntlet designed to erase your fragile existence. The average life expectancy hovered grimly around 30 or 40 years, a depressing metric heavily dragged down by the staggering reality of infant mortality. Nearly half of all children born into this cold world perished before reaching their 5th birthday. A simple winter chill, a fleeting fever, or a brief period of malnutrition was all it took to snuff out a fragile life. There were no protective vaccines or warm incubators, only frantic prayers whispered into the uncaring dark. If you managed to miraculously survive your vulnerable childhood, you entered adulthood already fundamentally exhausted. Women faced the relentless, deadly gauntlet of unsanitary childbirth, bleeding out on straw mattresses while clinging desperately to the hands of helpless midwives. Men were routinely felled by mundane agricultural accidents, where a simple scrape from a rusty plow could invite a lethal blood infection. Death did not require a glorious battlefield. It waited patiently in the mud of your own backyard. Beyond the daily hazards, vast and indiscriminate reapers periodically swept across the trembling continent. The bubonic plague could swiftly transform a bustling, overcrowded city into a silent, rotting cemetery within a matter of weeks. Relentless famines, spurred by a single season of rotting rain, could systematically starve entire villages. You did not enjoy the modern privilege of a peaceful retirement. You simply labored until your shattered body finally refused to carry the heavy burden any longer. The final exit was rarely marked by grand elegance or lingering remembrance. Funerals were hasty, pragmatic affairs, driven by the urgent need to prevent spreading disease. There existed no chemical embalming or polished hardwood coffins to protect the shell of the departed. You were wrapped in a simple shroud, placed into a shallow, undistinguished hole in the crowded churchyard and quickly covered with damp earth. Your identity was swiftly swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape. When we look back upon this distant, brutal era from the safety of our modern sanctuaries, we often choose to willingly blind ourselves. We cling desperately to fictionalized tales of chivalrous knights, noble queens, and candlelit banquets because the stark, muddy truth is simply too uncomfortable to digest. The illusion of a simpler time is a psychological defense mechanism, allowing us to consume history as gentle entertainment rather than a harrowing testament to human suffering. Yet, the most extraordinary truth of the Middle Ages is not found in the endless misery, but in the astonishing stubbornness of the human spirit. Despite the grinding poverty, the pervasive filth, and the constant shadow of sudden death, these exhausted people still found the capacity to laugh in the flickering firelight. They sang bawdy songs, forged deep bonds of love, and extracted frail threads of meaning from a world that actively tried to destroy them. Human resilience is not born in palaces, it is forged in the absolute dark. As you prepare to slip into your own clean, soft bed tonight, surrounded by the invisible miracles of indoor plumbing, climate control, and modern medicine, take a quiet moment to honor the calloused hands of the ancestors who survived the dirt. They endured the unbearable so that centuries later, you might have the privilege of viewing their gritty reality as merely a passing dream. Thank you for joining me on this long, shadows-filled journey through the forgotten realities of the past. If you found comfort and insight in our exploration tonight, please consider leaving a gentle like and subscribing to the channel to support future nighttime wanderings. Before you close your eyes and surrender to sleep, I leave you with one final thought. If true comfort and absolute safety are strictly modern inventions, is our current, overwhelming anxiety born not from a real threat to our survival, but from completely forgetting how powerful we are when we simply have to survive?